Welcome to this ELA webinar with the title Comprehensive Approach in Addressing Domestic Violence, presented by Fundar and commented by Cecilia. Welcome everyone. We're just going to go through some generals of the webinar and to the bios of the presenters. Cecilia Toledo has a master's degree in human rights from the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico. She's a researcher and expert on gender issues, domestic violence, and children's rights. Before joining Fundar, she worked in the legislative branch of the Mexican government, at the Mexican Congress as a policy advisor, and as chief of staff at the North American Relations Committee of the Mexican Senate. Our other presenter is Cécile Lachenal. Cécile has a PhD in law from the Institute of Latin American Higher Studies, Sorbonne University, France. She's a researcher on human rights, specialized in indigenous rights and gender issues. Prior to her time at Fundar, Cécile worked at the Center for Research and Higher Studies in Social Anthropology in Oaxaca, and as a consultant for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, working on access to justice for indigenous people in Oaxaca. So thanks to the presenters. The webinar will also be commented by Akosua K. Darkwah, who is the director of the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy and a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Ghana. She has also been a visiting scholar at Duke University. Her research interests focus on the sociology of economic change, organizations, gender, and work. In the past 10 years, her research has centered on women in the informal economy, specifically traders in global consumer items and domestic workers. She has a PhD and Master in Science in Sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Bachelor in Sociology and Psychology from Vassar College. And I will be the moderator of this webinar. My name is Janet, and I also work in Fundar. Before we start the webinar, we just want to give you a few reminders. See this below the space where the presenter video is, to your right, there is a chat space where you can post comments and send in questions. And you can also interact with other participants or the moderator. I see that some of you already have been using it. So I invite you to introduce yourself in that chat, to tell us who you are, what your organization is, and what do you expect from this webinar. I'm just writing a message there so that you can see. Also, you can hear this webinar in English or Spanish. You can click on your preferred language on the bar at the bottom of the page next to the chat section. So if you want to listen to this webinar in Spanish, you just have to put Spanish. And if you are okay with English, you can just leave it. Depending on what you want to do, select the appropriate option, general or questions from the chat channel group options. So if you just want to introduce yourself, you can use the public chat. And if you have a question, a specific question for the presenters, there is another chat called questions, and the presenters will get those questions directly. Also, if the question is in another language, click on the translate button to read it in your preferred language. Finally, if you want to have a private chat with the moderator or any of the participants, click on the person's name and chat with the person you want to talk. So also, if you have any doubt throughout the webinar, there is a question mark at the bottom left, and that is also technical assistance. So I guess now we are good to start the presentation, and I will give the floor to our presenters.
Hello, good morning.
It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'm Cecilia and we're going to start the first part of the presentation. And my colleague Cecilia Toledo we'll continue with the second part. So this webinar has the aim of enabling us to have an opportunity to talk and think about the comprehensive approach for understanding and tackling domestic violence. It's a little bit a matter of going back over a research study that we conducted. All of the organizations that have taken part in this discussion. And it's a document which is in the Ella page. So the idea here is not to go over the document particularly. There's a lot of information in it, and you can look at it. There'll certainly be things there that we're not going to deal with at the moment, but they are, or we could certainly refer to the document here. The idea that we had was to focus on the importance of this comprehensive approach and what it is for dealing with domestic violence and how it's really being incorporated in certain instruments in work in Mexico. So starting with why it's important to adopt a comprehensive approach to address or deal with domestic violence. We should start by saying that a lot of the studies on domestic violence or violence towards women or gender violence mainly focus on the causes of violence and trying to understand what the factors are that generate that violence. Evidently, there is a lot of theoretical discussion about this issue. But we could say that here what we were interested in is seeing the input of Heise in 1998, who proposes a model which tries to systematize the various positions, because the various positions were always partial. Some would show the factors that had more to do with the person, individual factors, people's lives, their own personal history, and also in the household, in the family. So if someone, as a child, a boy or girl, had experienced violence at home, there are theories which are generational in nature, which suggest that it's very likely that these people, in turn, will be aggressors when they're adults. So let's say that there was a current of thought which was more likely to address domestic violence in the individual and family aspect. So the person was at the center of their focus, and showing the individual reactions that could influence the person's violent history. So these two levels, in fact, violence can be exercised both by men over women or women over men. And here, finally, people will talk about domestic violence because it doesn't distinguish so much between the sex of the aggressor and victim. The aggressor may be a man or maybe a woman, and the victim may be a woman or a man as well. So, the approach is the domain where the sphere where the violence occurs. In this case, the household, the family, or in Latin American, we talk about intra-family violence. So here, the important thing is that violence is defined related to the sphere in which it occurs and the nature or the type of relations between the people involved. The contribution of Cécile then is to systematize or produce a model of the causes of violence, both domestic or violence between couple in the family, with other perspectives which are more focused on the violence that can be experienced in the family, but in connection with a community, for example, or the places where people live, again, family, but where people have to go as well, where they carry out their activities, where they work, out in the street, on public transport. Such places would constitute this community level. And also, in the model incorporates society as a level, a more macro level, in which, well, this talks much more about the broader social spheres which enable or facilitate the reproduction and production of behavior practices which are violent. So we can say that these are the four levels that his model brings together to propose a model to explain the different factors which are involved in generating violence towards women. That's why it's said that domestic violence in its multifactorial aspect has all of these levels. So we have to, according to this model, we have to think of this violence in terms of a wider macro approach of gender violence. Why is this model so important? Well, it explains the causes, and so it gives us a pattern to be able to think about what actions we can take to tackle the violence at the different levels where it occurs. So we can think about activities which will tackle the violence individually, in the family, in the community, and in state institutions, and in the culture as well. So this is the reason why we feel it's important to have this comprehensive approach. You'll realize that I've been talking overall about domestic violence. This is our issue, but I've also used the word gender violence, and the term violence against women, towards women, and this is a big theoretical concept, and I don't want to go into it in detail much here because it would take too long, but it is important to bear this in mind because it has different approaches and but it has important effects on how people think about approaching the problem, or the strategies and the actions carried out by institutions to influence violence, and to think about protection measures as well for women who suffer from violence. In brief, then, I want to mention in general, when we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about violence that puts more stress on the sex of the victims. And when we talk about gender violence, we're talking more about the purpose of violence, i.e., when we're talking about gender violence, we're talking about actions and arguments. There's emotional or sexual violence and all the different sorts of violence, but they have as an aim to maintain women in a situation of submission or over men. So there's a lot of debate and theoretical debate about this. There are many different approaches, and of course then many different proposals for trying to offset and change this, to remedy this violence. There's an author who has to be mentioned because he's very important. This is Johnson. He has talked about trying to differentiate between gender and domestic violence. And he talks about situational violence, which is a violence in which both men and women can be the aggressor, because there are manifestations of violence which could not have as a purpose keeping women in their traditional gender roles, and distinguishes this from what other people call gender violence. He would say patriarchal domination. That's one of the experience. In some of the manifestations, the purpose is to maintain women in that situation of domination and submission over against men. Well, so these are the sort of discussions that are still open to date, but they are important for trying to understand the type of methodology that's used when people conduct research studies into violence, to research violence towards women. And in our countries, there are institutions that try and carry out surveys to measure this violence, and they have to know what sort of categories they're talking about when they're talking about domestic violence or gender violence. Here you can see the importance of defining the categories that we're going to be talking about, and because also this influence is a little discussed in public policy and policies in general. Now, briefly, since we've been looking at this model, or the importance of it, and at the same time the different aspects used in this comprehensive approach, talking about domestic or gender violence and whether it's the same or not, we have to bring the discussion to more specific terms. I want to add something extra here so that we can go on and understand what's happened here in Latin America with or rather how violence towards women has been tackled. The other thing has to do with the importance of the human rights perspective. In Latin America, the success of the feminist movements and the human rights movements has meant that domestic violence has moved out of the domestic sphere, where it occurs, to be made visible as a public problem, as a problem that institutions, that the public institutions must take measures for. It's no longer a private issue between a man and a woman, a couple, or even a family, but it is a public problem. This involves state intervention and public policy. And on that basis, the categories help to prevent, care for, punish, and avoid this violence. In Latin America, there's a specific context which we feel has a lot to do with explaining how the human rights aspect is important for the approach to violence towards women. Briefly again, because the public in Latin America know these things, but it's important to remind ourselves that in the 90s, when there was a wave of transition to democracy throughout Latin America, then in view of these authoritarian states and the arguments against them was the human rights argument. Another important element is, and the social and feminist movements were also adopted this. This is when in Latin America the human rights movements arose in Latin America together with other civil society movements. Another thing that we think is important is that here is the poverty and profound inequalities between men and women. This is a structural inequality in the view of the feminist organizations. And so there's poverty or inequality, and the effect it has on women means that it truncates their citizenship. They might recognize their political and social rights and so on, their right to participate in the public sphere, but their social inequality and their economic inequality, which persists, affects the full exercise of women's human rights. So, another important thing here in Latin America is the adoption in 1994 of the Inter-American Convention of Belém do Pará, which is for preventing and attending and sanctioning and eradicating violence towards women. Here the interesting thing is, and I just want to highlight this aspect of the convention, is that this is the instrument that is important because it conveys the argument. So the convention's argument changes the argument from prior to the convention, which viewed violence in terms of inequality and social injustice. That was the original focus. And then it moves over to a human rights focus. But we shouldn't forget that the human rights argument comes from political liberalism. So it's also an argument which fits into all these transformations in economic and political terms in the region. And that clearly finds its equivalent in the argument for democracy. But there's a new player appearing here, and that's not just the government or legislation, but trying to change this reality from the paradigm of inequality. But now, with the paradigm of human rights, a new player comes onto the scene, the political scene, which is the judiciary and also the police. Not particularly not so much as they want to play that role, but because they have to take on the interpretation of violence as a question of rights, and so they have to intervene as a judiciary to see, for example, if someone's rights have been breached, and the police also are clearly the first stage for reporting these things. Now, clearly, this is still just emerging in Latin America. These players are the least sensitive to women's reports. In Mexico, there's a sentence of the Inter-American Human Rights Court in Campo where they establish that in the public ministry, in the police forces, in the reports of women about the disappearance of their daughters, issues which are cross-cutting now in the investigations and inquiries, and you can see the effect in the case of the feminist side. Well, so that's just to put things forward, the importance of this perspective of human rights.
And although this comprehensive focus is important, it's to overcome welfarist help and to generate new conditions for the women to build a project that is free of violence and a life free of violence. So that is not necessarily sufficient. And the human rights focus has been built as a focus that does allow to build this, partly because it places women as a subject of rights, of human rights. So, from this point of view of women as a subject of human rights, women can define and establish and demand the recognition of their sphere of autonomy and freedom, and how they can establish relationships with their families, with couples, and with the communities and the state. And as these are rights, when I'm talking about new role players that would come into this new stage or the new scenario scene and intervene and eradicate such violence. Well, as these are rights, so there is a mutual obligation for the other people, but also for the institutions specifically, to show respect and to guarantee those rights. And precisely the non-respect of these conditions represents a violation of these rights, and it may be sanctioned by the state and its institutions. Right now, I think that this would be all for now, for my part. And I don't know if we could just take a pause to share just a couple of questions or comments. Janet?
There is a question coming from Aloysius, and he asks, male chauvinists think that advocacy against domestic violence is advocacy for feminism. and he wants a comment from the experts. So if you want, we can pause to reply to this question.
Let's see how. Let's look at the question here because I couldn't hear you very well. The Malechauvinists think that violence against, that domestic violence is the defense. It's a defense for feminism. Any comments about this from the experts? Yes, this issue about the discussion between domestic violence or how to tackle domestic violence, this is specifically violence is specifically towards women, because the figures, the statistics show that victims are mainly women here, and also there is this discourse that from the feminist movement that states that this violence, although it takes place within in the homes, it is a violence that aims at keeping women in their traditional roles, that gender-based roles. Okay, defense against domestic violence is defense for feminism. Well, yeah. Well, and what is wrong about this? What is wrong about this? Okay. I don't think. Okay, unlike. Okay, let me think a little bit as to how I could just formulate this. I think that the feminist movement is not against talking about domestic violence, but what it does is that it places it in relationship with other forms of violence. So for me, that is a wider explanation. Unlike the studies that are strictly focused on domestic violence without, and they don't know, and they do not want to see it from a feminist perspective, from a gender violence focus that keeps a focus on keeping women in a situation of submission. Yes, that is a partial explanation of violence. So yes, they can account for certain things, and specifically, they have contributed with this idea that of generational violence. That means that if a child, a boy or girl, has grown in a violent environment, here during childhood, there is a lot that it is really likely that he or she develops this type of attitudes and behaviors once he or she reaches adulthood. So for me, I really think that, number one, that feminism, there's nothing wrong with feminism, and we should not think that if we think in a different way from domestic violence, that doesn't mean that we are going against. I don't know if I answered your question, and if there are any other questions, or if we just carry on a little further with our presentation so that we can. Okay, there is another question here, but it is a little bit more specific. So I think that we will leave this question for the end of the presentation, if you agree with this, so that we can just carry on, and I would like to share with you a little bit more how in Mexico we have incorporated those approaches, the comprehensive approach and the human rights approach. And so now I will give the floor to Cecilia Toledo. She's going to speak. Yes. Hello, good morning to everybody, and good afternoon to others of you, depending where in what time zone you are and in what country you are in right now. What I want to share with you now is, and it's also, you can also see it in the paper we submitted, in the regional paper that we submitted, that has to do with all that has already been shared to you by Cécile, how we landed on, or how this was gradually transformed or became more specific action. And in that sense, we want to share with you, or I am going to share with you, about how all of this landing or transformation took place, both from a comprehensive point of view, just as Hazy proposed it, and that was already shared to you by Cécile, but also how the paradigm on human rights that is quite present in Latin America right now, and that has permeated both on the establishment of a regional human rights system and as well as the inter-American system, how this also has made an impact or influence on what we know as the second wave of reforms, in which violence towards women is already dealt with in a more comprehensive way. So, to put this a little bit into context, I would like to tell you that, okay, on the last period of the transitions towards democracy that were started in many of the cases in between 1980s, 1990s, there were countries, and Mexico was one of them, of this last wave of democratization, to call it in a way. So from that decade onwards, the incorporation of the human rights principle become a very important pillar for the strengthening of democracies and to inspire all the reforms, both political and legislative reforms for the new regime. And in that sense, the violence towards women is dealt with from a comprehensive and larger approach, and also with a human rights approach, because as I already told you earlier, and Cécile also mentioned it, in Latin America, the Belém do Pará Convention that is unique at a regional level because it is an instrument that it is mandatory for all the states. And in addition, it includes principles of human rights, but also it makes violence visible from these various approaches in the various environments. So we have these two very big forces that right now are very influence on the reforms that are taking place in this last period of transition. So Mexico specifically, and what comes later on, and because of the feminist movements and the human rights organizations and the victims organizations, but also a series of women, a number of women with feminist ideas that successfully access political power, the Chamber of Deputies, and so this is kind of alliance is made with the women that puts this need as a priority, this need to discuss how the violence towards women is going to be dealt with or tackled in Mexico, by taking also into account that the Juarez case had already been made visible, and it had, so it was put in the spotlight in the international community because of the seriousness of the murders, but also because of the lack of actions, the impunity from the Mexican state. So it was an imperative to deal with these problems. So in this this context and in this moment when with this time when the Mexican state is pressed by the international human rights community, but also inside Mexico, because all of these women's organizations, these women who are in the political power, how all of this successfully bears an influence on the fact that by 2007 we could work on the design and the publication of what our colleagues in Mexico know as the General Law on Access for Women to a Life Free of Justice, about violence, free of violence. So this is a law that was published in 2007. And why is this law important? It's important because of various reasons. First, because this law, first of all, revisits what we already talked about, the cases focus, and also this statement from Belén do Pará, and to establish that there is various scopes, in which violence can take place. So this reinforces the idea of violence towards women as a public problem, not just an individual problem, but a problem or a problem that it's only relevant to women. No. So in this way, and from this line, the law recognizes that violence can take place from various scopes. Like, for example, the family, within the family, the community, and the public spaces, the streets, public transportation, etc. Also the working space, and also there is institutional violence, and this is a very specific contribution in the case of Mexico, because it also recognizes that the omission from the public institutions is also a factor or concrete actions that victimize women who want to report or are looking for legal support. That also is violence towards women, and it contributes to all violent situations. And lastly, and with this we successfully take care of the feminicide. So the violence in terms of feminicide is recognized. So we first have this recognition from various forms of violence. So domestic violence is located within these scopes as the violence that takes place in the family, within the scope of the family, in the private sphere. Why is it also important? Why is this law also important? Because it includes in this, with the influence that it bears, with this comprehensive approach, this law, the law incorporates as well many actions, not only to deal with violence in these different scopes, but also at different levels, from the care given by the state. So this allows to prevent, at a stage when violence is not a violation to human rights of women yet, at a level when care can be given specifically to the women who are already victims and who have already been victims of some sort of violence, and the sanction also. And finally, the eradication. That is the goal, what we aspire to with the state actions, both from legislative and public action. So we've got these different levels, in terms of the state intervention to give sanctions. That means by giving different, use the police, political interventions, laws. So we have this large state of scenario of the state's intervention. It's also important to point out that in addition to this comprehensive approach, the law has also a human rights perspective, and this is very, very important to keep in mind, because under this rationale of protection of a woman's human rights, the main subject, the main beneficiary of this law are the women. So all the actions, all the obligations from the state at these different stages, because we have to remember that Mexico is a federal state, so the division that we have the federal level, the provincial level, and the municipalities, and that is the smallest or the lowest level. So at all of these levels, we have this obligation to protect the women's human rights. So this is very important, because all these actions are articulated around this. So this law, in addition to placing the women in the center, it also assumes or establishes various obligations to ensure or guarantee the exercise of their rights, and therefore guarantees sanctions for the violations, and at all levels. And I want to clarify something here, this is that although by understanding violence towards women as a serious violation to human rights, it is also established, but this law, it is not a criminalizing law. So this first wave of laws that emerged in Latin America, had a focus on that aimed at criminalizing the aggressor, as a understanding that in this way the violence could be dealt with, and it was because also this responded to a rationale in which the state withdrew from guaranteeing the exercise of rights, and instead of that, it was easier to sanction, to prevent that this crime could be perpetrated again. So it was a series of criminalizing actions were setting into motion to reduce those factors that are motivating or encouraging inequality and the status of submission of women before men. So this law does not have a criminalizing approach. Finally, or something that before I carry on, and because we have our colleague Akosua from Ghana, Sijensa, we would like her to be able to give us some comments on this approach, this criminalizing or sanctioning approach, based on because of the work that we had jointly carried out. We know that domestic violence in Ghana has an approach that permeates. So I would like Akosua, I would like to give the floor to Akosua now, and maybe if you could at this time provide some ideas as to how we could carry out this comparison.
I just want to make two quick comments about the differences between the case in Mexico and the case in Ghana. I think, as the two Cecilias and Cecile have already mentioned, the Mexican case, the Mexican law is comprehensive in the sense that it looks at the issues from different levels. So there's the family level, the individual level, the community level, the state level, and so on. The Ghanaian law isn't spelled out that comprehensively. However, I have to point out that if you think of comprehensiveness in other ways, you could argue that the Ghanaian law is comprehensive. It's comprehensive in two ways. One, we look at both men and women, but secondly, we define family very broadly. So given our context where family members or people living in the same domestic space may not necessarily all be blood relatives, because we tend to have what you would call domestic workers living with us. We defined our laws such that in the domestic setting, abuse of domestic workers was incorporated. So if you think about that and you think about the domestic workers as employees, then there's a sense in which the law looks at not just the family level, but also the workplace environment. I think I will hold off on the other points I want to make regarding other issues that have been discussed for later. So Cecilia, back to you.
Thank you, Akosua, for this comment you just made. Now I don't know if perhaps we can give time to reply to some of the questions that people have made to the presenters. So Cecilia and Cecile, if you are okay with it, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Cecile and Akosua, for the comments on this conversation and the importance of the comprehensive approach for tackling violence. I'd like to suggest that we can finish the presentation now. This is the last slide where we give specific details about the integrated approach and the human rights perspective and how this is included in the law. And very briefly, I'll explain this. And then we can go on to have a question round. Some have come up already with regard to the presentation. So, well, anyway, to finish off now, we'll talk about the importance of the law. One very important aspect that we want to highlight is that it incorporates in diversity of level. This is also reflected in the way the state can provide care for women victims of violence. And this is very important because the design aims to provide care for and tackle the situation of women who are victims. So that is how this particular perspective is very interesting. So what we want is to propose a design of a comprehensive model of care and a human rights base. First, because the protection model at institutions proposes of the connection with all of the different state entities, the public health system first, then the specialized prosecutor's office, and third is the area covering domestic violence. And then there's the shelters, the specialized level. These can be both public and private. So these three institutions are liaising. And as we can see in this slide, they are connected because women can find protection there in these three aspects or places. It is also designed in this way because health and justice are precisely the stages where violence or the impacts of violence can be dealt with. Women often have to leave their home for the sake of their security. They have to make a report. They need psychological care sometimes as well. So these are early stages in which violence is still not a physical threat to the women, whereas in the shelters, in the external care centers near the shelters, these do provide specialist care, because at that level, women can no longer stay at home because the intensity of the violence is affecting their personal integrity and their basic rights, their right to life, and their right to free movement and so on. And so that is where this option of shelters arises, and that is where they can go, either because they are sent there by relatives, taken by them, or sent through the health and justice institutions, and they can find the care that they need to meet their basic food, clothing, and have a safe place to be with their children. But also, and this is the main difference, it's a place where they can be careful with a human rights perspective, because they get legal and psychological advice, and there's a strong need for them to understand violence as a problem found throughout the various structures and entities. It is not their fault, it is not their problem if they're suffering from the situation of violence. So in this sense, we can see, just to finish, that there is legislation with this in the comprehensive perspective. We can see how in a specific action, which is care for women who have been victims of violence with their children, how this model of protection includes these two major focuses which are present in this model. The comprehensive focus is important because it establishes liaison between the three institutions, health, justice, and the shelters at the different levels as well, but also with the human rights perspective, where you can provide care which seeks to enable women to transform the way they live and manage to exercise free of violence. So I leave that here because I think that of all the questions that come up there from you who are listening, we should be able to answer as far as possible and have a dialogue. We can listen to each other at least. If not, as you know, we can also continue this discussion and learn about domestic violence and the comprehensive approach. I hope this conversation will have clarified what we're talking about now, and so okay, then we will start to answer the questions, and I'll pass the mic to Cecilia so that she can start answering the questions. Thank you. Well, then we've got a list of questions here up on the chat. So we've been asked by Maima, why not include other aspects like the community leaders, faith institutions, all of those who are involved in this comprehensive approach? Yes, well, I think that what Akosua has just presented here in the discussion is that we have talked a little bit more about this comprehensive focus as a model. It's been built. And subsequently, we always have to think about the contexts in which we live. So, on the basis of context, I think in Africa, and seeing the questions coming in here, I think that it's also, there's a comment here, for example, there are other forms of domestic violence in Nigeria which is against the domestic employees. They have no voice to be able to report the violence that they suffer. And so there's also the case of the domestic workers in Latin America. But what I want to say is that contexts are important. Family structures are different depending on the country and religion and a lot of things. And so the model isn't strict. What the model tries to establish as certain elements, and then see how these can be developed with content, depending on the context that we're living in. So, in this sense, depending on the country, community leaders or some religious leaders could play a role, an important role, depending on the importance they play in their communities, directly with the population and teachers as well. But to talk a little about the situation in Mexico, the challenge also to this comprehensive approach is that if we're going to afford these various spheres, and we think about the actions that could be taken in those levels, what does this involve? It involves coordinating activities, and this is the purpose that Cecilia was speaking when she mentioned the law, the general law of women's access to life free of violence in Mexico. The purpose of the law is to try to get all the entities to liaise here with the state, for example, with respect to the state's obligations, and connect all these entities up, get them to liaise in prevention, with their consent, with prevention, care, sanction, so they can tackle all the aspects of violence towards women and make sure that these are taken into account. It's not saying that this is working. This is to say how this could work. That's another question, of course. It's another challenge, of course. So in this sense, for example, in Mexico, the Public Education Secretariat has a series of activities and programs for fostering gender equality, and so to try in the classrooms, through teachers, through books, used by children at school to foster a culture of peace, a culture without violence. It is a very big problem because the minister or priest in the community also could get involved. what happens in Mexico is violence towards women is considered normal. So even the Roman Catholic Church has some discussion and some arguments maintain that women have to help men, and if your husband has hit you, well, you just ought to take it and make sure your kids are okay, and so on. So you have to look for other players who could be allies in trying to build a culture of peace. So that would be to let's group together the questions from my mind, Kinte. Akina Gonzalez has asked what measures are being taken to raise awareness in the judiciary and the police about gender and domestic violence. Well, in Mexico, there have been several steps taken for the judiciary. In 2013, the Mexican Supreme Court, together with experts, has formulated a protocol for judging gender crimes. It's a protocol which explains the steps, the stages that judges, magistrates, even ministers have to take to make visible inequality. This is focused closely on explaining that there is equality between men and women. It isn't simply legal or formal, but in reality, the reality is that there is inequality, and if you have to judge fairly, judges have to raise awareness about the specific situations of inequality between men and women. So this means, for example, that you can make visible the gender issues in when women are murdered. In Mexico, there is a category of feminicide that's being discussed, but it's rarely used. But I think it does exist, but it's rarely used by judges, and it could start to have an impact. But there is a protocol then for judges. I understand that subsequently in the police forces, we have a federal state in Mexico, so you've got the federation and 32 states, and each one has their own competences, competent authorities, and so the police, there's a federal police force which intervenes in organized crime issues, for example. You have the state police. So, okay, we depend on the states. So in some states there have been protocols developed and training events for the police to try to present them cases of violence against women when they receive reports from women, so that they're treated with dignity and respect, and not simply blame them or not believe them, or say you're making a fuss, or really ignore what they're saying, or make them wait for a long time. So there are protocols which are trying to raise the awareness of the police. The fact is there's a long way to go yet. It could be a lot more effective because the interviews with women, what they tell us about what happens to them when they go to the public ministry or the police stations are still very negative. And also another action taken in Mexico is that of developing the protection orders. These are tools which allow women who don't want to make reports but to ask for protection. So they can, for example, prevent the aggressor from coming into their homes. They can keep them at a certain distance from their homes and the children's schools. This with the backing of the police, and then other measures like of a more civil nature, civic nature, of recognition of property, the woman's home, for example, and protect their goods, or allow women to take her things out of home if it doesn't belong to her, or to take her identity papers and the children's identity papers out of the home if it's violent. There's also, well, quite a lot of measures taken here, but in general, these are not measures that have the judges and public administrators are very familiar with. Some interpret the law to say that there has to be a formal report in order for a protection order to be issued, and they're wrong there. So that would answer Angela's question. And then going on to, let's see, Cecilia, I don't know if you would like to start. I don't know if you want us to share the space. Yeah? Well, there's a question here. Customers ask a question about what the effect of the convention of the Belém Para has been on the region. Well, it's got a regional structure. It's complex, and it is related to the Organization of American States, which is what has created the convention, the American Human Rights Convention, and this establishes a number of issues which affects the Latin American region. All the countries have adopted these measures in Latin America, Canada and the US, for example. And from this convention, there derived several different regional legislations. But all the member states have have pledged to implement the mandate. There are also two major pillars, which are the Inter-American Human Rights Court and what's it called, and the Commission as well. These are the two entities in charge of implementing the convention and establishing, and I think this is very new on the part of the Inter-American Court, and the Commission as well, which is that they can receive petitions. So people, once the internal competent authorities have not answered them adequately, then people can lodge a protest against the country, in this case Mexico, at the Inter-American Human Rights Court. And that is something that can be done. And that means that the human rights aspect is very strong across the region. Kofi had another question as well, and we will try and answer this about he said he had understood that in the human rights perspective, this would that the human rights perspective would be included in the comprehensive approach. And so how do you distinguish these rights? Well, the comprehensive approach, the model, formulated by Hazen, is a model which tries to systematize different approaches to violence on the basis of starting with the idea of domestic violence. So that's where they go into the individual, family, community, and social levels. Okay, that's what we said. But it's an approach which systematizes these things. It shows these various levels. That's its contribution to be able to have this comprehensive nature and break through the approaches which are more partial, which only focus on the person or the community or the culture, not just because we're in Mexico we have a chauvinist culture. That's not the only thing that explains violence towards women. Anyway, so what Heza proposes here with this model is to see if these approaches they do have a contribution, but he wants to see if they're sufficient in themselves. So he presented them all, but it's not necessarily true to say, and this is the difference with the human rights perspective, it is not necessarily true that they put women at the center of the issue. Through the comprehensive model, it includes all the causes. Domestic violence can be violence against women within the family or against men in some cases, or towards children, girls and boys, but also, as some of our colleagues said here, the violence can also be against the domestic workers that domestic servants living in the home, or even against relatives who do not live within the home. They live in another house, but because they have a family relationship, then they come to the home, and anyway, the violence against them. So the difference between this perspective and the human rights perspective is that the human rights perspective is interested in women. It focuses on women. It is women who suffer the aggression. And I think that would be the difference. So I think this is more specific, and that is why the law in Mexico, unlike the law in Ghana, the law in Mexico is a law for women, and children are also included and contemplated in it. They are considered to be possible victims. But what it is about mainly, because in Mexico there are tools and instruments and norms and standards which are specific for children. So this law is specifically for women. And that's the difference that we make here.
I have two questions that have just been by our colleagues. Diana asks if the institutions are corrupt, and how can we work with them, and what relevant actions can we take to work for gender equality? And this is a little bit difficult question because yes, there is. It is true that for the state, and okay, we all recognize that the state has the obligation to come and take care of and sanction any violence towards women. And it does it through the institutions and its public bodies. Yes, just as it happens in Mexico, and I guess in other countries as well. You can come up with a design, okay, that's fine in the law, but the implementation, okay, is something different. You cannot necessarily check there the benefits of the legislation. So concretely in Mexico, organizations such as Fundar, where Cecile and I work, we have developed as a strategy that lead to make this pressure, this political pressure and social and public pressure visible, and to how the state is corrupt. Okay, that is what we're trying to make visible, and we do this by demanding accountability. For example, how is the money spent in the budgets? How are certain levels of authority working, public levels of authority working? There are cases where it has become apparent how, because of corruption, the preservatives reach the states or certain municipalities, and through public campaigns, it has been proved where are these not where the public policy is not translated as a law in these concrete actions. So that somehow could contribute to gender equality. I think it does up to a certain extent, but we cannot forget the other part as well, where the public servants also exert violence towards women when they come to them and report the cases, and they are ill-treated and they are marginalized, and this has a lot to do with the cultural construction. And when we're talking about this sphere of the structure of the culture, yes, it is worthwhile there to wonder, is this a matter of the poor design or a poor implementation of the law by an institution? Because we can see, like for example, in the Mexican case, we can see the chauvinistic culture reproduces itself. You can see how it develops among the public servants. And beyond allowing, and they, instead of allowing this exercise of rights for the women, they actually allow, they keep on perpetrating chauvinism against them. So yes, it's complicated, but yes, from civil society, we can make progress, and some of the things that I can see is that we can make, that we raise awareness, we call the state to accountability, and to ask them what they're doing. Thank you. And I have some other questions yet. Okay, that's good. Argelia asks a very specific question. Are there statistics about domestic violence in the indigenous communities in Mexico? There are statistics that have been developed by INIGIT. Only, and I think that these statistics are only prepared based on the reports. So it is already, it offers only just one part of the violence that is being registered. It's only the violence that is actually reported. And when we're talking about domestic violence in the indigenous communities, okay, it's quite complex issue. So yes, there are statistics, and there are also a lot of studies, research studies on violence in the indigenous communities towards women. There is a comment, and there is a question, but I find it a little bit hard, from Rumaima. So her comment first is, she says that the comprehensive approach does not only mean reforms in the law, but also, for example, thinking on an education system that is based on human rights. Yes, we are very much, we very much agree with you that in the sense that the comprehensive approach is not just about producing laws. Here we focus also on taking care of the violence. Yes, and yes, it is something needs to the state's role needs to be emphasized here, and all these tools that the state has to intervene must also have to be stressed. Okay, so the laws and mechanisms. Yes, this focus is also the focus in our presentation. But yes, if we want to talk about a comprehensive approach, then we must also talk about intervention. We have to talk about eradication, and we also need to talk about sanctions. Yes, so, but yes, I totally agree with you. Yes, that go through all of this, but can also think about the health system. Women who come with wounds, okay, with physical injuries caused by violence, that are visible. They are not detected as having endured or in actually enduring a situation of violence in and your question also has to do this is a hard question, it's a difficult question. It has to do with what happens when countries, when laws are implemented in the countries. So she says that human rights, the recognition of human rights for women are worthless because when women go and report, they are not going to be paid attention, because according to her comment, within the laws of Sharia, a man can just abuse his wife. So this is a complex problem, because this is a problem of a conflict of rights. Which right is going to prevail? The human rights, right, or the Sharia rights? And in a society in which, because of various reasons, the religious rights are prevailing, or the rights of a religion, a specific religion, prevail, and that religion just makes it a statement that the women have to be submissive to men. So it's even harder in that context that women can exert their rights. But here we can see, as these are situations that are more complicated and in which a lot of pain is involved for women. But if we see this from as a conflict of rights, then there is kind of a fight, struggle that might take place, so that women's human rights at the end prevail, okay, above the rights of religion. So I think are the type of struggles that we can see in organizations that work in these countries, for example, human rights organizations that deal with women's rights, women that try to fight for women's rights to be recognized. But just making a recognition doesn't change things. Here in Mexico too, yes, everything is recognized here. And that is the situation right here. Okay, on paper, the laws, everything is clearly stated and looks quite advanced, but that doesn't mean that we are actually living a transformation that leads to eradication, okay, of violence in the women's lives. But there's still little changes, but we're giving baby steps, and we need to keep on pushing. Yes, for example, in Mexico, human rights discussion is a discourse that does help women and their victims and the feminist movement to advance the women's cause and try to advance equality and eradicate that this inequality and violence. So that's it. And we have to carry on fighting and looking for probable alliances. So we have another question, Lena, and we are so happy because these are to get these questions because your questions are so interesting. She asks us, what is the best strategy for prevention and from what age the setting up of programs is appropriate? And she just says that in Bolivia, as a country, these policies are mostly focused on women and not very much on men. So I would say that all of this part that involves policies and actions towards prevention, something that at a regional level, they show that it is one of the areas that are the most important and necessary areas because they prevent all the problems that we are all very much familiar with. Okay, and they're talking about violence towards women, that affects their health, their capacity to work, and to take care of their children. So, although there is a stress on a policy on prevention actions, well, unfortunately, the reality is quite different. So we use criminal law, okay, to sanction. That might be more effective. That also about prevention. I think that, at least in the Mexican case, I can tell you that we find a little bit of everything. We have publicity campaigns, and they're not very much consistent. They come up every now and then. And there is a very interesting experience that I can share with you, to you and to everyone who is participating in this webinar. We all went to our shelter here in Mexico City that is called Fortaleza, the fortress. And in this shelter, you have like different work areas, and one of the areas where the women work is the prevention area. And through this office that is mostly focused, is like the visible face, the face of the refuge of this shelter, is that they have carried out a community-based work that is very interesting. And what they do, okay, what this little team carries out is that they go and they raise awareness and talk with public school principals around their area, specifically in their surroundings. And the interesting thing is that they told us it's not just about talking with the school principal and tell them we want to help you to eradicate violence among children or among the students, but also you have to, they have to go to other levels of authority. For example, they have to go to the public ministry of education spheres so to tell them how important it is to have these talks with the children. And I remember, okay, and then they've been working for the last 12 years, and they're talking with the secondary students. And it's not just about talking with the principals, they also talk with the parents to involve them in this activity. And the outcome here was that they gave the talk both to students at an age where they're already noticing and realizing what is going on. For example, in Mexico, there was a survey on violence during courtship time. Okay, and it's terrible. Found that adolescents as young as 15 are already experiencing violent relationships with their boyfriends or girlfriends. So, yes, and so many teenagers actually living this. So, with these groups of teenagers, this team goes from this office at this Refortaleza shelter, and they share these talks with them, and they also organize workshops with them where they make them aware of the problems, and they also make them aware with materials, workshops about the importance of starting incorporating the gender. So this is a very concrete case that I can share with you, but at state level, okay, I'm talking about public policies in Mexico, there have been some attempts, and I don't know if Cecile can here supplement what I'm saying here, but to include violence between couples in the public education books or textbooks, because education in Mexico is mandatory until high school level. So the textbooks would include a chapter on violence. And just to supplement this prevention, this topic on prevention, because there are several questions about this, and also Maima, I think she also says that yes, we should also think on working. Okay, the parents also can talk with their children about this. Yes, but just making the connection to Diana's question about the need to make boys aware, and also the relation. I also connect this with the question about forgiveness. I can't remember the name of who just said, asked that how we can do this, because violence also, or emotional and psychological violence, okay, we don't even realize it, that we can also exert violence, okay, on other people. So it's very hard to recognize this type of psychological or emotional violence. And I think that yes, many of the actions are focused on women. Yes, because when we're talking about giving care to the victims, yes, we consider that in most cases the victims are women. So, and the children as well, both boys and girls. But also here in Mexico, organizations have been established for both women, both men and women, that work on the manhood of men, and how men can start thinking and reflecting on their identities as men and their gender identity, away from violence, as trying to be like exerting other roles and trying to be a man who, for example, takes care of his children, who has time to show compassion and for his children, that plays with his children. So not being just that, exerting that traditional authoritarian model, role model, a role in which they just tell others what to do, but actually making men trying to build this role away from a dominating man and trying to work on these new identities. And this is quite interesting in this violence environment and how to prevent it. Maybe we could also start rethinking about our roles, our models, our education, and how we bring up our children. So this implies thinking about lots of things, and about this also implies thinking about when we are really reproducing or producing attitudes, violent attitudes from the emotional and psychological violence. We need to make this visible as well. And I think that this is one of the hardest things to do, to work on, because it's quite standardized and it's viewed as normal in our societies. And it's a very, very intimate level, because this is something we do all by ourselves. Nobody looks at us. So we would need to just be our own judges and look at ourselves and reflect, or go maybe to spaces where we can share all these behaviors that we might be having towards other people. Okay, we can to our children, but also to other people. And I think that we have already answered. Okay, one last question.
We can answer this. Coffee says, is there a systematic evaluation of the effectiveness of the approach, of the human rights approach in Mexico? And can we share any publications? Yes, there is some. Well, I don't think we have any though that measure effectiveness. Not because the problem at the moment in Mexico is that the law that we talked about goes back to 2007, so it's nearly 10 years old, and people are seeing that it's not so much that there are changes needed to improve it, but a systematic study of the effectiveness of the human rights approach. At the moment, I can't think of any. There are partial studies, for example, the Flaxo study. You will certainly find studies by Luis Vasquez, who's worked a lot on human rights focuses and public policies and such things as violence and human rights, but they will be partial studies. They'll be on certain specific issues, but it could be a way forward, and we would think about that. And if we find anything, and if we remember anything, then we can publish it here on the Ella page. And let's see. Well, I think that would be all from us. We are very grateful to you. I wonder if we could both get into the screen here. Okay, thank you very much for listening and for your questions. It's been a pleasure to be able to follow up the discussion. It's been very nice. And we hope you'll continue to participate and we can continue to keep up this conversation. And answer any questions. We're happy to do so. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Gracias a los presentadores. No sé si Akosua. Creo que eso es todo.
Thank you to the presenters and to Akosua who commented the webinar, and especially to all of you for attending it. I just want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, so we will make sure to share it with you. And well, thank you very much to all of you, and let's hope to keep this discussion in the platform. Also, thanks to VoiceBoxer staff and to L staff who were supporting us throughout this webinar, and to all the translators. So, thanks.